Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and welcome back. So this week we are doing chapter 21, and it's week 9. So we have a quiz due this week on Sunday, and the chapter is about imperialism and colonial rule. And if I use those words interchangeably, I basically mean the same thing in this context. And what I'm talking about is one country going in to take over another country in order to reap the rewards of natural resources, that sort of thing. So the biggies this chapter are India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And what we're talking about now is really sort of modern imperialism or modern colonialism, I'm sorry, or high colonialism in some cases. But maybe it's best to start this chapter with something you probably don't know about. And so just stick with me for a minute. So in November of 2015, our United States Congress passed an act called the Space Act of 2015. And not too many people know about it, but it is true. And the Space Act is a law that Congress passed that grants the citizens of the United States the rights to mine and sell materials from outer space. So, in other words, if you or I came up with a spaceship and we could land it on an asteroid and extract gold or silver or something like that, we could keep those materials. So that's actually a U.S. law. And the reason it's maybe a little relevant or helpful in this lecture is because we're talking about a time period in the book of the late 1800s and early 1900s, this age of imperialism, and basically it's the same type of thing. It's a situation where a country decides, hey, we're gonna go mine all the minerals in India, and okay, or we're gonna go extract all the natural resources from India, and we're not really gonna ask the Indian people. We're just gonna go do it. So that's what this chapter is about, this imperialism and colonialism, and it sort of ties in nicely with this backdrop of industrialization that we've been talking about, because it's really the need to satisfy these industrial operations that leads countries to colonize other countries. In most cases, the countries they colonize are third world countries. So, for example, rubber is going to be a big thing in the late 1800s. So to get the latex from the rubber tree, generally that's in a tropical environment like the Philippines or like in areas in Africa. So many European countries and the U.S., were looking to build rubber plantations because it was real profitable. So rubber's a good example. Mining and minerals are a really good example, and there's a current day corollary to that we can talk about too. But certainly gold and diamonds. England colonized South Africa, and the main reason was because of all of the diamonds and gold there. So this phase of imperialism or colonialism is more modern because it's based on needs of a growing industrial world or industrial society, and contrast this phase to imperialism, or contrast this phase of imperialism and colonialism to what happened earlier. So like when Christopher Columbus was heading to America in 1492. He wasn't really interested in rubber or mining of coal. Now, obviously, they were interested in gold, but the early colonial powers that settled or colonized or exploited North America, South America, such as Spain, France, England, they weren't really interested so much in raw materials as they were interested in wealth. So gold, silver, but they were also interested in proselytizing or promoting Christianity. So really that early phase of imperialism is based on Christianity and spices, I think is how the book puts it. And now this second phase in the later 1800s is really a response to industrial needs. But at the same time, it reflects this idea of white superiority and racism. And I would say that maybe this chapter would be better named, high racism, because really what you're talking about here is white Europeans or white Americans going into Asian societies or societies in Africa where there are people of color, or like the U.S. attacking the Philippines because they thought that the Philippines were a degraded people and that Americans could help, and so that's sort of the gist of how I feel about the chapter. There's a debate at the end whether imperialism and colonialism were good or a bad thing. Is it the duty of societies who think they're sophisticated like ours to go help other societies that are not as sophisticated? And so that's the argument in the back of the book. Historians argue, and certainly I guess there's some good that comes from colonialism in that, and India is a pretty good example. I mean, India has a modern Western court legal system. They have a somewhat modern education system. So there are a lot of artifacts or remnants from the colonial era that are still in place in some countries that may be good, maybe something that Westerners like us see as good, but again, just because we think something is good, it doesn't mean it necessarily is. So that's sort of what you have to wrestle with throughout this chapter, and this is an easy chapter for us. It's not that there's not that many notes, and the questions are really easy. But let me just kind of go through it. So what modern colonialism is based upon, and the answer there is it's always based on the interest of the colonizers, but it's also wrapped around this idea that there was a need to gain raw materials for manufacturing, and there's also a need to sell stuff that you make into other markets. So countries that were colonized were not only seen as an opportunity to be a place where natural resources can be exploited, but it's also a place for markets. In other words, can we sell stuff to these people? So that's kind of the big thing. And I think there's a question on the quiz that says the primary objectives for the new imperialism, and there's really three of them. They're to exploit natural resources, so that's what we just talked about, to open up markets for manufactured goods, and also for capital investment. So those are kind of the biggies, and they're all revolving around this idea of commerce and making money. So that's the new imperialism, and you'll see a question like that on the quiz. You're also going to see a question on the quiz that asks you about indirect and direct rule. And what that's referring to is that when someone like England or the U.S., for example, went somewhere to colonize or to take over the property, were they going to put in local officials to be the leaders, and if those local officials were loyal to the mother country, then those are indirect rulers, and oftentimes that's the way things were set up in areas that were colonized. But on the other hand, oftentimes there are direct rulers. So in other words, England goes in to take over India, and in some of the protectorates or some of the areas, they put actually English governors or leaders, and those are direct rulers. So that's typically the way that colonized countries are dealt with, either via indirect or direct rule, so you should know that. The biggies, of course, that we talked about are India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And India, you probably know, was taken over by England early in the 1800s, and it was brutal for a lot of Indians. The westernization of India had major consequences on their economy. Some would argue good, some would argue bad, but certainly changes in the economy in India. And there's a map in section 21.3 that shows you the extent of British control. And the Brits built schools, and as I mentioned, instilled their legal system into India. But generally, it didn't work out well for the local populations. And in subsequent chapters, we're going to read about the IRC, the Indian Republic movement, and how India eventually breaks away from colonial rule. But that's sort of the biggie. So if you understand nothing else out of this chapter, know that for almost a century, India was under the brutal control of the English. So there's that. And then the next section, 21.4, talks about colonial regimes. Sorry, I can't talk today. In Southeast Asia. So here we're talking about like Vietnam, the Philippines, we mentioned, Laos, Cambodia, all of those islands sort of south of China and Japan, if you kind of can index that South Pacific area. And, the Philippines for sure and Vietnam have been victims of colonial takeovers forever. And certainly America played a huge role in the Philippines. There was the War of 1812, or the War of 1812, I'm sorry. The Spanish, it was a different lecture. The Spanish-American War, and during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took Cuba, but also invaded Manila Bay. That's in the Philippines, and really had this brutal revolution. And it was the Philippines revolution was against the Americans. The Americans were trying to Americanize the Filipinos. They thought that they were a degraded people, and that if we could impose our values and our religion on them, and it would help them and lift them up. But the real reason that the U.S. wanted Manila Bay in the Philippines was as a dropping off point on its way to Asian markets, a refueling station, if you will. So the Philippines, again, victims of colonialism under Spain and then under the U.S. So that's the main thing in Southeast Asia. The other thing to think about when you're reading about Southeast Asia is that it'll talk about the French taking over Vietnam and into Laos and Cambodia. So just kind of keep that in mind, because when we get to the modern era and we talk about the Vietnam War, the French colonials are still involved at the very, very, very beginning of that conflict. So maybe we'll remember this when we get to that point. But so Southeast Asia is the other area that was really sort of victimized. And then finally, Africa. And Africa is a different case because after the slave trade started to die off, and the international slave trade really ended for all practical purposes in 1808. It's where the U.S. got out of it, and most slavery was waning as far as the slave trade goes. And so Africa became less important to a lot of merchant marines because the slave trade was dying off. But there were many coastal areas that were colonized, and certainly South Africa, and you'll read a little bit about it in the book. South Africa was basically a mess. The Brits took it over, but there was also a presence of Dutch there who were the original settlers, like in the 1600s. You've maybe heard of Afrikaners. That's Dutch farmers that have been there since the 1600s. So there's actually three groups at play in South Africa: the Afrikaners, which are white racist Europeans, the Brits who have colonized South Africa, and then all of the local African residents. And it's a brutal story, and we'll read more about South Africa as we move on. We'll get to apartheid and Nelson Mandela and all that stuff, but we have 100 years to go. So that kind of gets you oriented into what's coming up. So that's a quiz question. What three areas does this chapter talk about? India, Southeast Asia, and Africa, because those are the areas that were most victimized by European and Western powers. So keep that in mind. And this stuff is still going on today. I mean, there's a lot of rare earth minerals like in your cell phone or in your pad, in your computers. A lot of those still come from Africa, and a lot of those minerals are still harvested under suspicious conditions, let's just say. And again, it relates back to imperialism for raw materials for industrial manufacturing. So, I mean, it's all still happening today to some extent. So there's that part. And then, no surprise, the last section of the chapter is the emergence of anti-colonialism. Well, I guess you can kind of make an assumption that if outsiders are going to come in and take over a country, that there's going to be a backlash, that people in that country are going to unite against their oppressors. And so, really, no surprise here. I mean, think about that, and think about that as you observe whether it's history or a personal issue. If you come in and try to take control, people are going to push back. And so, it's an important lesson. But there's two things interesting in this part, and there's a quiz question in this part too. So the quiz question is, the fundamental weakness of colonialism is that it is always based on what? Okay, that's the quiz question. And the answer is obvious. I mean, people go to colonize other people for some advantages. There's a reason to do it. So the answer to the question is, the fundamental weakness of colonialism is that it's always based on the self-interest of the colonial powers. In other words, if the U.S. goes to colonize the Philippines, they're doing it because the U.S. is interested in being closer to China. They could care less about the Filipino people. So anytime the English or Europeans or anyone in the U.S. says, hey, we're going to go colonize these people because we want to help them, because we feel that they're degraded and we want to give them religion, or we want to give them modern education. Well, anytime you hear that, it's just a justification for imposing and exploiting other people. And you'll read about Rudyard Kipling, who was a British writer and poet, and the white man's burden. That's all BS. I mean, but that again is the way that the English tried to justify this, and the U.S. was no better. In the Philippines, we're going to go in and lift up these poor, degraded people. You read about the concept of social Darwinism in this chapter, and that's what we're talking about. Only the strong survive sort of situation, and that was real common during this period of time. As a matter of fact, I'll end with this story and then kind of check through the quiz. But as an American historian, I remember studying the World's Fair. The World's Fair in the late 1800s in Chicago. I should know the date, but I don't off the top of my head. But the World's Fair had exhibits of countries from all over the world, and this was set up in steps of how sophisticated these societies were judged to be. So, they would always have displays of like Africans first, and then Asians, and then work their way up into this social Darwinist scale of sophisticated societies. So I probably didn't explain that very well, but this idea that white Europeans and white Americans were superior is endemic, and this time period between the 1800s and I would argue up to World War I, 1917, somewhere in there, was really this age of, they call it age of imperialism and colonialism, but it was the age of racism. So let's just kind of go through again, and let me make sure I got all the quiz questions covered for you real quick. I apologize. Okay, so primary objectives of new imperialism were to exploit natural resources and find outlets for goods. And then there's a question about indirect and direct rule, so know what those are. That's pretty easy. Know why the U.S. was interested in the Philippines. Know that colonialism is always based on what? The self-interest of the colonizers, so understand that. And then know the three big areas that the chapter talks about. So if you know those things, you're good to go. Sorry this was a short lecture, but again, not really a lot in this chapter we want to latch into at this point in time. So that's it. Be safe. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.